This is Learning with Coach History. Hey everyone, this is the fifth of 7 lessons in progressivism. Today we'll talk about Teddy Roosevelt and his square deal. In this lesson, you'll learn about President Theodore Roosevelt's success in promoting reforms at the national level. The key terms and people for this lesson: Theodore Roosevelt, square deal, the jungle, Upton Sinclair, Meat Inspection Act, Pure Food and Drug Act, conservation, and NAACP. Theodore Roosevelt became president in 1901. He was bold, ambitious, and full of energy. He had been active in sports and in politics. In the Spanish-American War, he led a fighting unit called the Rough Riders. His personality made him a popular president. Roosevelt used this popularity to get his programs passed. He wanted to see that the common people received what he called a square deal. This term referred to a program of progressive reforms sponsored by his administration. President Roosevelt believed that modern America needed a powerful federal government. He used the power of the government to help solve the nation's problems. Roosevelt also used the power of his government to deal with the problems of trusts. Trusts were large companies that had control over their markets. Trusts first drove smaller companies out by lowering their own prices. Then, when the smaller companies were gone, the trusts could raise their prices again. They no longer had any competition whatsoever. By 1900, trusts controlled about 80% of the U.S. industries. Roosevelt supported big business, but he also wanted to stop trusts that harmed people. He had the government sue harmful trusts under the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890. In all, Roosevelt filed 44 antitrust suits. He was called a trust buster. In 1902, about 140,000 coal miners in Pennsylvania went on strike. The mine owners refused to negotiate with them. President Roosevelt called both sides to the White House to talk. He threatened to have the government take over the mines. The two sides agreed to have an arbitration commission help settle their differences. The commission succeeded in reaching a compromise. From then on, the federal government would often step in to help settle a strike. In 1887, the Interstate Commerce Commission, or ICC, was established to regulate the railroad industry. It was not effective, however, because it had little power. Roosevelt pushed through laws that allowed the government to better regulate the railroads. One such law was the Elkin Act of 1903, which made it against the law for railroad officials to offer rebates to shippers to use their railways. Another was the Hepburn Act of 1906, which strictly limited the distribution of free railroad passes, a common form of bribery. Roosevelt's effort resulted in fairer shipping rates and strengthened the federal government's power to regulate the railroad industry. After reading a book called The Jungle by Upton Sinclair, which described filthy conditions in the meatpacking industry, Roosevelt appointed a commission of experts to investigate the meatpacking industry. Their report backed up Sinclair's descriptions of filth in the industry. Roosevelt then pushed for passage of the Meat Inspection Act. This law passed in 1906. It called for strict cleanliness requirements for meat packers. It created a program of federal meat inspection. Also in 1906, Congress passed the Pure Food and Drug Act, which halted the sale of contaminated foods and medicine and called for truth in labeling. The government's Bureau of Chemistry was charged with enforcing the new law. This bureau later became the Food and Drug Administration. Before Roosevelt became president, the federal government had paid little attention to the nation's natural resources. The U.S. Forest Bureau had been established in 1887, but the government seldom stepped in to prevent the loss of the ever-shrinking wilderness. John Muir, a naturalist and writer, persuaded Roosevelt to set aside 148 million acres of forest reserves. The president also reserved other land for water power sites, resources exploration, and wildlife sanctuaries. In addition, Roosevelt created several national parks and monuments. These include the Grand Canyon, Meyer Woods, Crater Lakes, and Mesa Verde National Park. Progressives had long believed in appointing experts in their field to study and make decisions about issues. With this in mind, Roosevelt appointed Gifford Pinchot as head of the U.S. Forest Service. Pinchot was a professional conservationist who was aware of the latest scientific and technical studies. Roosevelt and Pinchot believed in the conservation of land, meaning some land should be preserved as wilderness while other areas would be developed for the common good. Roosevelt and Pinchot were opposed by Moore, who believed in complete preservation of the wilderness. Indeed, Roosevelt signed the National Reclamation Act, which funded large-scale irrigation projects that transformed dry wilderness into land suitable for agriculture. This act became more commonly known as the Newlands Act. One such project under the Newlands Act was the creation of the Roosevelt Dam in Arizona. The Newlands Act established the precedent that the federal government would manage the precious water resources of the West. The environment proved to be more of a focus of concern for Roosevelt than civil rights. Like most progressives, the president failed to support civil rights for African Americans as a whole. He did work to assist a few individual African Americans, though. Roosevelt stood up against Southern whites to defend the civil rights of several African Americans. For example, he appointed an African American as head of the Charleston, South Carolina Custom House, even though whites in the city were against it. Also, he ordered that a post office be shut down when whites did not accept the black postmasters he appointed. Roosevelt also invited Booker T. Washington to dinner to show his respect for Washington's work. Washington was the African American leader who was the most respected by powerful whites. Washington urged that African Americans accept that whites would always discriminate against them. Not all African American leaders agreed with this idea. In 1909, black leaders, including W.E.B. Du Bois, founded the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or the NAACP. The organization pushed for civil rights and racial equality. The progressive movement, however, continued to focus on the needs of middle-class whites. The two presidents that followed Roosevelt also did little to attempt to ensure the goal of racial equality.